I'm Matt.
I'm Kerry.
We are the Stagmer brothers of Baltimore Knife and Sword. We're going to be building some of your favorite weapons, and some weapons that you've never seen before.
This is Man-at-Arms, Reforged.
This year, 2016, is the 400-year anniversary of the Dandao Manual. In honor of this anniversary, we decided to make that sword.
The Dandao is the longest of the Chinese two-handed sabers. It comes out of a tradition dating all the way back to Qin Shi Huangdi, the unifying emperor of China. It was recorded in a manual called the Dadao Fanxuan by a man named Cheng Zongyou in 1616. This was the first manual of its kind to incorporate illustrations along with each technique, and also to write down those techniques in a straightforward fashion rather than the poems and things of the time.
Our friends at Smith & Forge have once again challenged us to use 19th century techniques. And to do that, they've shared this large rolling mill with us. This rolling mill actually came from Victory Racing Plate, where it's made horseshoes for the last 80 years. In addition to using the rolling mill, we'll also be using the Smith & Forge Bradley power hammer that they shared with us on a previous episode. We're going to be using some earlier techniques as well. There'll be a lot of handwork that you would have seen going right back to the beginning of the Iron Age.
Here you see a smelter, similar to the early period Tatara and the Chinese smelters. We used iron sand to turn it into steel. As the iron sand passes through the charcoal, it is reduced. It is separated from the slag or molten glass and the steel. The steel lands at the bottom and the slag comes out right below my feet.
Now that we've been running the smelt for about an hour, time to start slag tapping. Ilya used an iron rod to plunge in about 4 inches from the bottom, relieving that slag from our bloom. We have to remove the slag from the bloom, or it'll block not only our inlet for our air, but also contaminate that bloom and make it a lot tougher to forge later.
We've been running it for already 5 hours. And soon, very soon, the piece of bloom, the steel that we made from sand, is going to be birthed out and made into this fine sword.
It's finally time to remove the bloom. We decided to go the traditional route and knock the whole smelter over and remove the bloom that way.
Our bloom was so big, we couldn't extract it whole. There's more steel stuck to the walls and the bottom of the smelter. However, the whole smelter is too hot to safely extract all the pieces at the moment. After collecting all the little pieces of the bloom, we stuck them all together and got rid of the slag. So now, Matt is assisting me in preheating the billet in the charcoal forge so we can continue with the consolidation and the folding. Next, I'm going to go to the Bradley power hammer and start slowly massaging the bloom all together into a perfect shape so we can cut it and fold it.
Ilya now directs me while I strike. He's not only going to tell me where to hit, but how hard to hit and how often.
Folding gets rid of impurities and makes a heterogeneous billet into a homogeneous piece of steel. Once the steel is homogeneous, it is ready to produce the blade.
Since we don't have a lot of time on this build, we're going to go ahead and move to the Smith & Forge power hammer to speed up the consolidation a bit. Some people might consider this cheating, but if you watch a lot of documentaries of traditional forging, they often have a power hammer just like this.
The 19th century is known as the golden age of mechanics. The power of human muscle has been divested onto the power of steam, electricity, and cold steel. Europe, United States, Asia have all started industrializing and producing steel rolls, wrought iron, and crucible steel in mass. The shops of Sheffield use giant rolling mills to roll out sheets big enough to cover the side of a ship. The rolling mill right here, the power hammer over there, have made mass production possible.
I'm going to be working from sterling silver ingots. They weigh about 1.5 ounces. We're going to be taking them down from 1/8 inch thick, rolling them all the way down to 18 gauge in a single strike.
Dandao came about at a time when China was threatened in the north by Manchus and Mongols, and in the south by piracy. It's not known why two-handed swordsmanship had a resurgence at this time, but perhaps it was because when you're dealing with a mounted opponent, as a foot soldier, it's very useful to have a long grip. It adds a stability for countercutting, cutting the horse going by, and also defending yourself. And that particularly long blade allowed the foot soldier to be able to reach a rider as he passed by. The Dandao is also a particularly effective weapon against the spear, which is a very common weapon on the battlefield at the time. The long grip allowed one to deflect a powerful spear, and the particularly long blade allowed one to be able to move in close and deliver a countercut.
After a long discussion with Scott, he pointed out that most single-edged Chinese blades have a hardened edge insert. So Ilya decided to use some W1. Using our W1 insert as a hot cut tool, he cuts into the bloom. And instead of removing it like you normally would with a hot cut, he leaves it in there, lets it radiate the heat so nothing will scale up, returns it to the forge, brings everything up to welding temperature, and then forge welds it together. It's now time to turn our billet into a sword. Ilya moves to the Bradley power hammer and starts drawing his bar out. You can see him here using the hit turn technique, which keeps everything nice and true and allows you to draw it out a little quicker and keep your even heat. The last step to do before beveling is to remove the excess material off the end of our bar. Ilya holds a hot cut tool as I strike. Afterwards, he trues it up with a file and then forges that point over to the proper shape. Now that we have our bar forged out to length, it's time to start laying in those edge bevels. Ilya is going to start on the back spine and then flip the blade around and start working on the edge. While Ilya is forging in our bevels on the blade, I figured now was a good opportunity to show you the layout for our piece. Scott Rodell was nice enough to provide us with a 1-to-1 scale drawing of this sword. The suggested length is 35 inches of blade, that's from shoulder to tip. And then the cross section was measured every 5 centimeters all the way down the blade. So it really gives us a good indication of what the taper should be on this blade. Some of the major differences of Japanese and Chinese construction are up here at the point where there's no defined Kisaki, it just rolls right in. And down here at the tang, where our pommel's not just kept on by that Mikugi pin, it's actually peened on. You can tell by this little part on the tang. So instead of like Japanese construction where those fittings are put on the wood and everything's held on by the Mikugi pin, this has a Mikugi pin and the pommel's actually peened, and it's a little bit heavier, so it works as a counterbalance to really give you some more leverage on this really long sword. Since Smith & Forge once again has challenged us to use old school 19th century and before techniques, I can't use my sanders. So I'm doing the rough forming with a draw filing technique. It's really not that big of a deal since Ilya forged the bevels, both the back and the front, about 90% of the way through already. Just using the file and truing up those lines, and then I'll hand it off to him for heat treating.
So Kerry has rolled out the metal and brought it over to me. I have painted it blue and inscribed the design that Ilya has given me on it. We're cutting out 2 dragons. Instead of doing a die press to get 2 exactly the same or to etch out the pattern, we're going to use a traditional jeweler's saw, the fine saw blade with the teeth that go down and out. So I'm going to put the metal on the bench pin between the V's so it supports it. I'm going to take the saw blade and slowly start to get it to catch, and I'm going to saw it and follow the pattern, and I'm going to let the saw do all the work. I'm not going to push on it because the minute I push on it, the blade will break. We keep the saw blade extremely straight so that we don't have any beveled edge happen, which will make it easier, and we don't have to do any finish work before Ilya is going to inlay it.
We now need to anneal or soften the metal. This will allow Ilya to be able to force it into the cavity when he inlays it into the iron.
While the blade of the Dandao is going to be made from the steel we smelt ourselves, the fittings, mainly the guard, are going to be made from this Victorian-era wagon wheel. What we'll have to do is to heat it up in the charcoal forge, cut it in half, heat it up, and take it to the rolling mill to reduce the stock to the appropriate thickness.
Much like the original way that wrought iron was produced, we're going to be using this large rolling mill and progressively close the dies down so that it makes it thinner and thinner to reach our final thickness.
After I heat up the wrought iron, I hand it off to Kerry. As he pushes it into the rolls, Matt is catching the reduced stock on the other side. We have to do it multiple times to get the dimensions we need. We might have been a little bit overzealous getting this new awesome tool. All that wrought iron stretched only for this small piece. I've already cut out my guard from this big piece of wrought iron, and now I'm starting to file the edges so they're completely smooth, which will get me ready for the inlay of the dragon. I've affixed the guard to the plank of wood, which is now clamped in the vise. I've traced the outside of the silver dragon and started carving away the background. After the background is carved away, I'm going to dovetail the edges. Right now they're like this. I'm going to pry them so there's an angle. And when I press the silver in, like this, it will occupy the empty space and be locked into the guard.
With this really long blade, Ilya's got to be super careful to make sure his heat's even. So he moves it back and forth over the charcoal, and when it gets to that perfect temperature, he moves to the quench. First step for making the handle in this sword is carving out the recess of the tang. After tracing it onto his pieces of wood, Ilya's going to use a couple different chisels and just remove that wood out of his way. He's then going to clamp them both together, get the shape he desires, and then we'll wrap it later.
Continuing his work on the handle, he now begins to engrave the metal fittings.
All right, I've been at this polishing for a while now. Really happy with this blade, it looks great. But it probably has several 100,000 layers in it, maybe even more. Trying to bring out some of that pattern so you can see. It's really fine. So I'm having to use a little slurry and some 2000 grit sandpaper, and I'm just taking my time. Oh yeah, you can start to see it now. Looks great. Can't wait to see the beauty shots. As we're now into the final assembly, the last step is to add our handle. Instead of using a silk wrap, we're gonna use a paracord wrap. You'll see similar wraps like this on traditional Chinese pieces. This being our first 100% historical build on Man-at-Arms with no modern tie-ins, I'm really proud of all the smiths on this one. We did everything from smelting, forging, all the intricate inlay and detail on the fittings. We stepped up big time. I think we did our first historical build justice, and I hope you guys feel the same way too.
Click here to subscribe, or click here to watch more episodes. Thanks for watching Man-at-Arms Reforged. We need to know what you want the guys to build, so tell us in the comments below what weapons you want to see next.